On a third. The First Amendment, number 37, requires the Commission on Afghanistan created in the base bill to include in its report all advice or counsel provided to the President by the Department of Defense personnel or other relevant administration advisors on the withdrawal of armed forces from Afghanistan. You heard the discussion I had with the chairman of the full committee. It is imperative that we fully understand the withdrawal of our armed forces from Afghanistan from planning to execution. It's concerning to me that our military members abandoned Bagram Air Force Base weeks before the completion of the withdrawal. We've all witnessed the withdrawal effort descended into chaos, culminating in a terrorist attack on our armed forces and innocent Afghan civilians by ISIS-K. While I also supported the withdrawal, we should not have lost 13 American lives in the process. The Commission on Afghanistan specifically requires an examination of the circumstances under which the Biden administration withdrew the armed forces from Afghanistan, and it cannot be accomplished without a thorough examination of the advice and counsel that was provided by his advisors. I'm glad that we managed to evacuate almost all of the U.S. personnel and citizens. It's concerning to me that some do remain in Afghanistan. The President either did not receive appropriate advice or chose to ignore his advisors. Either way, we have to get to the bottom of how this withdrawal went so very badly. So I will urge support for my amendment and ask for it to be made in order. Second Amendment, number 94, directs the Department of Defense Inspector General to investigate and submit a report to Congress on the assessment, planning, and presentation of Afghanistan withdrawal options by defense and intelligence personnel to the President. Once again, you heard the discussions with the chairman of the full committee earlier. It is so critical that we fully understand the withdrawal of our armed forces from planning to execution. The issue of Bagram Air Force Base, I think, needs to be thoroughly investigated. This amendment will allow for an independent, nonpartisan investigation into withdrawal, including key moments when operations went wrong. Again, the President either did not receive appropriate advice or chose to ignore his advisors. Either way, we must get to the bottom of how things went so very wrong. The third amendment I want to speak on is amendment number 796. It's an amendment by Mr. Bishop of North Carolina, and this amendment ensures that no federal funds are used to promote or advance critical race theory in the United States Armed Forces or the Department of Defense. Specifically, this amendment would prohibit federal funds from being used to advance or promote the superiority or inferiority of any race, that the United States is fundamentally a racist country, that the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution are fundamentally racist documents, that an individual's moral worth is determined by his or her race, an individual by virtue of his or her race is inherently racist and oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously, and an individual, because of his or her race, bears responsibility for the actions committed by other individuals of the same race. Look, there's little to be gained by promoting a philosophy that dictates you hate yourself, you hate your neighbor, you hate your country, and it has no place in the United States military. And I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Ms. Miller-Meeks, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I come before you today in strong support of my amendment number 686. Number 686, which would include my bipartisan bill, the Alexander Lofgren Veterans and Parks Act, as part of this year's National Defense Authorization Act. I was so proud to introduce this overwhelmingly bipartisan legislation with a fellow veteran, Congressman Gallego. I was even more proud to see this bill pass our chamber unanimously in July. Our common sense legislation would give service members, veterans, and our Gold Star families free passes to all of our beautiful national parks and federal lands for life. This amendment will support those who sacrifice so much for our liberty and freedom. Our nation is blessed to have some of the most beautiful national parks and public lands. Each year, millions of Americans access the more than 2,000 federal recreation areas, including national parks, national forests, and wildlife refuges. This includes some of the country's most iconic national treasures, from Acadia National Park in Maine and the Dry Tortugas in Florida to the Redwood National Forest in California and the gates of the Arctic in Alaska. In 2020, the America the Beautiful annual pass became free for veterans and Gold Star families. However, this change for veterans has never been put into law and could be undone in future years. My amendment protects these veteran passes by codifying them into law and making them lifetime passes instead of annual passes that would have to be resubmitted every year. Making the passes lifetime instead of annual also makes the job of the Park Service workload and postage easier and ensures our veterans have full access to all the benefits they deserve. Finally, this amendment also creates annual passes for current service members, which will be converted into lifetime passes once they retire. From sea to shining sea, we are a nation of incredible beauty and biodiversity. Congress recognizes both the mental and physical health benefits of outdoor recreation for current service members and veterans. As a 24-year Army veteran, I understand very intimately the sacrifices made by our military and their loved ones, and believe we must do whatever we can to honor these VIP heroes. My bill provides these Americans with free access to the land they sacrificed to defend. Our national parks are here for all of us. Getting outside into nature and enjoying our beautiful country provides an outlet and escape with both mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical benefits. No one is more worthy of experiencing open access to these incredible places than the men and women who fought to keep us free and the families who have made the ultimate sacrifice. Unfortunately, it is all too easy to pay lip service to the military's sacrifice, but then not follow through with action to recognize their service. We can never fully repay our veterans for their service and sacrifice, but we want to show our gratitude by giving them lifetime access to America's most beautiful natural landscapes. I urge all of you to support this common sense legislation, which this chamber has already agreed to, and allow it to be included in this year's NDAA. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Gomer.
Thank you very much. I have 7 amendments, and thanks. They are appropriate. First of all, one that the American Bar Association supported in 2006 that didn't make it into law. They support it again now. My office was notified. But under current law, our service members that deserve every privilege they can have under the law, they're not entitled to appeal decisions that put them in prison for life even, or death for that matter, but they're not entitled to appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. And this amendment, after all these years and efforts of trying to make it so, would allow a service member to file a writ or an application for a writ from the Supreme Court. That has not been the case before. There are cases that are certainly deserving of being heard by the Supreme Court, but the unfairness, the way the rating system goes, the way people can be intimidated, even at the appellate level by a commander, can leave really unjust decisions in place. So this is attempting to fix that situation. Of course, the military, when you sign up, you're not entitled to freedom of speech. That's very restricted. You're not entitled to freedom of assembly. You have to assemble whenever and wherever you're ordered to do that. But this is one that shouldn't be taken away. And it leads to other things that need to be corrected in our UCMJ. The Second Amendment removes the personal information from military investigation databases if the service member is found not guilty of an allegation. The lack of direct guidance on this provision has negatively impacted innocent service members that were in the process of being railroaded, but the system caught itself, corrected it, and yet when they attempted to apply for jobs or had other things come up, boom, they got hit with what happened in the service, even though it was very unfairly. The Third Amendment prevents commanders from briefing potential jurors on pending trials. And I know that may seem strange, but it has happened. And you may not be familiar the way juries are selected in the military, but I know from personal experience, my 4 years at Fort Benning, lower commanders were requested to send recommendations. Sometimes it was 2 or 4 people per company, maybe 1 from each platoon in a company, then up from the company, then battalion would pick from those and send some up, and brigade would pick from those and send. By the time it got to the commanding general, you had some of the toughest, most redneck folks ready to hang them high and put them in jail, because in the military, the convening authority, the person that signs the order to send a charge to be tried, that's the commanding, sometimes colonel in the Army, general, admiral, but that is also the person that takes all these recommended, extremely hard-nosed folks that were nominated to be on the panel, picks from them, and that's who sits on the jury. So when you hear jury panel in the military, this is not like a civilian panel where you come in and you have some people excused for cause. I can think of some incidences that, you know, no appellate court legitimately should have put up with, where people said, there is no way I will not find this man guilty if he uses an insanity defense. And the judge said, well, I'm going to order you not to consider it. Are you going to disobey my direct order? Oh, well, no, Judge, if you direct orders. And then they said, there is no way we'll find this man not guilty if he doesn't come testify for himself. Well, I'm going to order you, gentlemen. You know I'm the judge and I'm your superior, and I'm going to order you. You must not use that in weighing guilt or innocence that he used his Fifth Amendment. Well, okay, Judge, if you are. Anyway, they were all on the jury, and every one of them had shown cause that could not be rehabilitated. But anyway, the judge let it go because he ordered them not to consider it. That was good enough for him. So sometimes you get some situations that are grossly unfair, and at some point we need to have the highest civilian court go, come on, folks. We cut you a lot of slack because we know you need a system that's streamlined, but you still got to have some fairness here. And that's what all of these are aimed at. It also would, my Fourth Amendment would create a separate career track for military judges. As Justice Breyer recently said, you don't want the person that judges thinking of the next job. Military judges should be on a separate career track to avoid any undue influence impacting trial outcomes. Years ago, before I was in 1978, the Army, I don't know about the other services, but they had made a habit of appointing the new guys to be the defense counsel, and then when they got really good, they'd move them over into prosecution. And the commander that sent charges to be prosecuted was the one that would rate some of those people involved in the court-martial. And so that was changed, and no, you can't appoint somebody to be a defense counsel unless they have a certain minimum experience in the courtroom trying cases, and that was the case when I went in. That made it more fair, really did, but this has been a problem, and fortunately, it's not a problem all the time, but it is enough of a problem. It ought to be a separate career track, just like the defense attorneys were taken out of control of the staff judge advocate and began being rated by a separate defense system. The Fifth Amendment requires military courts to comply with the Supreme Court precedent and mandate from Ramos versus Louisiana that ordered all courts to have unanimous verdict. In the military, sometimes you'll have a panel of 15, and because a lot of them have been sent out on maneuvers or different things, you have to have a minimum of 5, but sometimes you only have 5. And it's not required the verdict be unanimous, and it ought to be when you're talking about locking somebody up for the rest of their lives. So this would bring the system into compliance with all the other things in the country when it comes to criminal law. My Sixth Amendment, the amendment requires all members of the convening authority to be removed from the rating system of a military judge. Since this is the guy that actually appoints the jurors that will sit on a given case, and actually at Fort Benning, they would sit sometimes for months until they had a verdict the commander didn't like, and then the commanding general would excuse them and appoint somebody else to be on the juries that sat on these cases. So it would help if we change that system. Number 7, that amendment ensures retroactively that members of the armed forces are not dishonorably discharged for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine. We've heard some horror cases where people have lost limbs, they've given their service, they're getting close to retirement, and because of their own physical situation, they elect not to have a vaccination. And let's face it, when basic message coming out of the administration is we have, as the president said, we've got to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated by making the unvaccinated take the vaccination that does not protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. That's the message that's being sent out from here. And service members should not get a dishonorable discharge if they've had a very honorable service but elect not to take the vaccination. If they're going to separate them, that's one thing, but it sure shouldn't reflect that service was dishonorable when it's never been anything but honorable. So those are the 7, and would humbly submit we really do need to make some changes here.
Thank you. Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first amendment is 385. In the fiscal year 20 NDAA, my amendment requested the Navy create a report on the feasibility of doing maintenance work on naval vessels at shipyards other than shipyards in the vessel's home port. The report was produced in spring 2020, and within the report, the Navy concluded that the law could be modified to allow the Navy to use non-home port yards to meet surge capacity where the contract would be for more than 10 months. And the yard has either a master ship repair agreement, MSRA, or an agreement for boat repair with the Navy and ABR. Amendment number 385 will allow the Navy to solicit contracts from non-home port shipyards for maintenance work should the shipyards meet the Navy's requirement for ship repair work. We have done the proper examination. Now it is time to give the Navy the authority it needs to reduce its maintenance backlog and better address our military readiness. And I know the shipyards in the Great Lakes stand ready and willing to serve. My second amendment, Amendment 789, creates a much-needed incentive to kickstart domestic manufacturing of our critical minerals. Introducing the Manufacturing America's Critical Minerals Act early this Congress, similar to last year's version, the bill allows American manufacturing companies to deduct 10% of the cost of purchasing domestically processed minerals critical to our national security. And I'm privileged to have Senator Blackburn of Tennessee as the Senate amendment sponsor, and I appreciate her understanding of the topic. Chairman McGovern, as I've discussed many times before this committee, our foreign rivals like China and Russia dominate the critical mineral value chain. They own child labor-powered mines in places like the Congo and then ship the materials back to China for manufacturing things like missile guidance systems for our F-35s, semiconductors, and solar panels. Chinese manufacturing is done cheaply with energy sources that have no environmental safeguards whatsoever, and workers toiling in sweatshops. Then they sell the manufactured items back to us, and American manufacturers just cannot compete, while holding America's defense hostage by monopolizing defense-related items. Manufacturing America's Critical Minerals Act has a Senate companion in this NDAA debate and will level the playing field for American manufacturing of our resources. And finally, Amendment 840. When our military service members enlist, they are often sold the promise that they and their families will be taken care of by the government. They are promised housing benefits, educational benefits, even free health care. It is evident that we have not made good on all of our promises. In 2016, Congress went a step further to walk back their promise. They included a provision in the NDAA that put new enrollment fees on service members who are on TRICARE select plans. Although implementation of these enrollment fees was delayed, much due to the advocacy of veteran service organizations that raised alarm bells on this, these fees are now in effect as of January 2021. Veterans on TRICARE select plans were sent a letter last year stating that they will need to start paying these fees at the beginning of 2021, or they would be disenrolled from the healthcare plan. They were given a 180-day grace period from the time of disenrollment to request reinstatement. The grace period is now over. As a representative of a very rural district, I am terribly worried that some veterans in my area are simply unaware that they have been kicked off the health care plan, that the next time they are sick or injured, they will be turned away or stuck with an enormous bill that they cannot afford. That is why I'm offering this amendment. Amendment 840 will eliminate the enrollment fees for those who retired before January 1st, 2018, and cap the enrollment fees for those who retired afterwards. This amendment is an incremental approach to right or wrong for the veterans who made such a great sacrifice for our country. I ask that my amendment be made in order. Thank you, and I yield back, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you very much. And before I go to Mr. Perry next, let me just say as a reminder that according to guidance from the attending physician, masks are required for all meetings in an enclosed U.S. House of Representatives controlled space. The CDC recommended measure further reduces risk of acquiring infection and potential risk of transmitting disease to an individual's vulnerable household members. Mr. Perry. Is Mr. Perry on? Well, we're going to skip Mr. Perry and go to Mr. Bilirakis.
And I want to thank you for allowing me to offer this amendment along with our ranking member, Member Cole. I'm offering today amendment number 558 of the fiscal year 22 National Defense Authorization Act. My bipartisan amendment with the support of Representative Ruiz and 33 other bipartisan members. My particular bill has several more co-sponsors. It's called the Major Richard Starr Act. And Richard Starr advocated for this bill for many years. Unfortunately, he passed away due to his illnesses, which were combat-related. This would expand eligibility to certain military retirees for concurrent receipt of veterans' disability compensation and retired pay or combat-related special compensation. I believe our bill is probably roughly 117 co-sponsors, and we have a sponsor in the Senate as well. In the past, military service members found to have endured a service-connected disability could not collect their pension and disability pay in unison. To receive VA disability compensation, veterans had to forfeit their retirement benefits and pay back dollar for dollar the amount that would have been owed to them if they had received both benefits. In the fiscal year 2004, the National Defense Authorization Act, the Congress created the Concurrent Retirement and Disability Pay Program. In doing so, veterans who were 100% disabled were authorized to receive both earned benefits known as concurrent receipt for the first time ever. Since then, the law has expanded the eligibility to receive military retirement pay and their VA disability pay concurrently to military retirees with 20 or more years of service and a 50% or higher disability rating. Under current law, concurrent receipt for military retirees who have a disability rating of 50% or higher was phased in through 2014. That was a great initiative of my father, Congressman Mike Bilirakis. But that's just a subsection, and and I do have H.R. 303. Many of you have co-sponsored that. That takes care of everyone, but this is just a subsection of this, and I want to go further if I may. While this certainly marks tremendous progress, medically retired veterans with less than 20 years of service who were wounded in combat must still offset their DoD retirement pay by their VA disability compensation. I think that's very unfair. Many of these veterans have the full intention. They had the intention of serving for 20 years or more and gained full retirement benefits, but through no fault of their own, were unable to do their service and sacrifice in the line of duty. So in other words, they were injured in the line of duty, so they couldn't serve the 20 years. Therefore, under current law, they're disqualified from receiving both their disability and their pension. This group of retired veterans, also known as Chapter 61 retirees, are arguably the most at risk because of their complex combat injuries and are just as deserving as those who serve greater than 20 years of service. By creating the CRDP, I firmly believe that Congress admitted that offset requirement of disabled veterans was wrong. Approximately 550,000 military retirees are eligible to receive both military retirement pay and disability compensation, but are prohibited under the current guidelines of this program. So the full amount is 550, but I'm only addressing between 40,000 and 60,000 veterans, so it's a subsection of that. In my view, I see these veterans as essentially being taxed for their service and sacrifice because they were deemed service-connected disabled. My amendment would remove that tax and the disparity between those combat disabled veterans and the rest of the population. My standalone bill and its Senate companion have received a wide margin of, again, bipartisan support amongst members, again, bicameral support in this Congress and in past Congresses, as well as the support of many veterans service organizations, including the American Legion, the VFW, DAV, VVA, the AMVETS, Military Officers Association of America, Fleet Reserve Association, American Ex-Prisoners of War, and the Association of the Navy, and I'm sure that none of them oppose this. None of these organizations do. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on my amendment, and I look forward to the discussion today. And I yield back, Mr.
Thank you
Chairman.
very much.
Appreciate it.
And the last person on this panel is Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I'm here to testify in favor of 5 of my amendments, and unless it's a breach of decorum, also testify against the amendment that is also pending before you. The first and most important is number 26, dealing with the War Powers Act. Dealing with the War Powers Act, number 26. The War Powers Act says that the President can't deploy our troops into harm's way for more than 60 or 90 days without an authorization to use military force. It is the only limit on the President's ability to send our troops into harm's way without congressional involvement. Every president since the 70s has taken the position that it's not constitutional, pointing to the fact that the President is Commander-in-Chief. Congress points to its power to declare war. So you have a bifurcated approach in the Constitution to who controls our war-making authority. What's very clear in the Constitution is that Congress has the power of the purse. And for that reason, we've had testimony before the Foreign Affairs Committee that this amendment will make the War Powers Act enforceable. In 2011, I introduced this on the floor on the Appropriations Bill. No money shall be spent in contravention of the War Powers Act. It was controversial. it passed. It's been part of every defense appropriations bill that has come up since, so you've already voted for it half a dozen times. It's now time to make this part of permanent law, not just 1 year at a time, but to say at no time should a president use congressionally provided funds to violate the War Powers Act. Amendment 51. We learned in Afghanistan that the State Department has a STEP program in which you can tell the State Department where you are, just in case when you get in danger, they can help you out. But we learned in Afghanistan, this is a voluntary program. This amendment would make it mandatory if you're visiting a war zone. Visiting Canada is different from visiting Kabul. And we had testimony by Blinken before us just last week or the week before about how they faced so many difficulties in evacuating Americans in Afghanistan because they didn't know which Americans were in Afghanistan. Number 746 is the Sherman-Waters Amendment to prohibit Americans from investing in Russian sovereign debt. This is to sanction Russia for their interference in our elections, including on March 16, 2021, the Director of National Intelligence said that Putin had authorized interference in our 2020 election. We have sanctions against Russian individuals, but now it's time to sanction the Russian state. There are economic analyses that say that this would increase the cost of Russia borrowing money by 0.5 percentage point, which is a big deal in the financial world. Next is Amendment 52, which prohibits military assistance to Azerbaijan because of their recent aggressive war against Artsakh and the Republic of Armenia. It is co-sponsored by 12 other members of Congress. Next is Amendment 28, which focuses on the Assyrians and also the Yazidis who have lived in northern Iraq, particularly the Nineveh Plain, and says that it will be our policy to work with those groups so that they can return in safety. The Assyrians, for example, have been a Christian minority since the dawn of Christianity, and they would like our assistance in being able to live in security. Finally, I oppose number 288, put forward by my good friend Mr. McHenry. This creates a working group of the CFTC and the SEC on cryptocurrency. You may ask, well, what's this doing in the NDAA? It has nothing to do with defense, nothing to do with our international relations. It has to do with the CFTC, which is overseen by the Department of Agriculture, which has not had hearings on this. And it has to do with the SEC, which is overseen by my subcommittee on financial services, as well as the full committee, which also has not had hearings on this. And you might say, well, what's the matter with creating a working group? When you get to the details, you see that this working group is carefully crafted to be in the control of the trillion-dollar cryptocurrency industry and not to have anyone on the working group that's dealing with tax evasion, sanctions evasion, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and nothing no one there who is focused on the know your customer and anti-money laundering provisions that I know Mr. Perlmutter is very familiar with, and which are the backbone of all of our financial enforcement. The SEC opposes this amendment. The chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Mr. Smith, opposes this amendment. It's a bad idea put on a bill that it has nothing to do with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. Any questions? Mr. Cole?
Just real quickly, if I may, my friend from Texas, I'm very inclined to be supportive. I represent a military district. I've seen some of these kinds of problems firsthand, and I think they're really thoughtful. I'm just curious if, do you know if House Armed Services has ever really, looked at these kinds of issues, had hearings on them? I guess what I would worry about, although I have enormous respect for your experience in this particular area, you've got quite a background and a body of expertise. you just don't want to inadvertently do something that messes up the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is an important instrument of regular order in the military. On the other hand, the kinds of abuses that you've talked about, I've seen a couple of those, and I know they're real. So I really think that's a thoughtful set of amendments. And again, I'm inclined to be supportive, but just curious if number one, would you favor that? I assume you would, but, I just, in my time on the House Armed Services Committee, which granted was many years ago, we spent a lot of time, and there's some really good work in this one on sexual assault issues and some things like that. So I'm not being critical of the committee at all. It does try to look into the overall culture and life of the military, and I think make positive changes. But has there been a series of hearings at all on this particular topic and how we would update this, or particularly providing this appeal option that you talked about, which I think is very important?
Well, like on the first one, the ABA has been looking at this issue for a long time, for many years, and they continue to support allowing an application for a writ to the Supreme Court. And the truth is, anybody who's familiar with the Supreme Court knows they're going to hardly ever grant that.
Right.
But it does leave open at least the chance that on something monumental, the Supreme Court can finally go, you know what, that's been unfair for a long time. We're going to take that up.
Well, I think it's helpful, too,
so-
just to have somebody looking over your shoulder.
Exactly. And when we talk to people on the Armed Services Committee, some say, I like the idea, but I've heard from this commander, that commander, they don't want it. And we're trying to be sensitive. Well, of course not, because if there's somebody you don't like, you want to run out. You don't want to be held to account. But that's where the civilian side comes in, that, we're a country that's supposed to have civilians over the military. I know Secretary Esper, when we had pushed an issue where there was great unfairness, he said he's never seen a problem. Well, I know there are problems, and so does Sergeant Miller behind me.
Wow.
So he's working for me now, and we're looking at these issues. But I don't know if more hearings before the Armed Services Committee would help, because there will be a flurry of calls. But even just on that first one, this has been looked at for years. At least give our guys a chance to at least make an application for writ.
Well, it just, for what it's worth, I'm supportive of that amendment, and I think the others ought to be looked at pretty seriously, too. And I just commend the gentleman for bringing that up here. It's something we don't think about very much. It's not the normal debate on either armed services, let alone defense approach, where I sit now. But again, having seen a couple of instances where, at least I think, there was real abuse inside the system and no means to check it or review it. I'm not saying I knew, I'm just saying I wish somebody else, had had an opportunity to take a look at it dispassionately. So just thank the gentleman for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you for your attention.
Ms. Torres? Any questions? Okay. Mr. Burgess, I know you're on this last panel, but you might want to ask yourself some questions if you.
It's very insightful, Mr. Chairman. I've got some good questions, but I'll submit them for the record.
Mr. Perlmutter?
I just thank the witnesses for testifying.
Let me see, who else is here? Mr. Raskin, Ms. Scanlon, Mr. Morelli. Okay. Mr. Desagne, Mr. Ross. Miss Ross, Mr. Neguse. Thank you all very, very much. We appreciate it. The next panel is Ms. Green of Georgia, Mr. Griffith of Virginia, Mr. Wenstrup of Indiana. Ohio. We'll just attribute that to.
That matters a lot in football season, Mr. Chairman.
They do.
Sorry.
Yeah, but on the football field, they don't play alike.
Well,
Unfortunately, my alma mater beat Indiana over the weekend in Indiana. It was a great game.
Okay, Ms. Green, you may begin. Just make sure your microphone is on. Okay.
Am I on? There we go. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I would like to discuss two amendments that I've offered to the National Defense Authorization Act. My first amendment, Amendment 41, would strike the section of the bill that makes women eligible for the draft. Drafting American wives, mothers, daughters for mandatory military service unnecessarily politicizes military service and would jeopardize the national security of this nation. The purpose of the draft is to rapidly replace combat losses in extreme national emergencies. It has always been about meeting the needs of the armed forces as fast as possible with the best replacements as possible. Men are, by their very nature, the best suited to meet these demands when necessary. The effort to draft America's daughters into frontline combat duty will undermine the military's combat prowess, lead to greater wartime casualties, and take away from the defense capacity. Men and women are not physically the same, and women do not possess an equal opportunity to survive on the battlefield in direct combat with battle-hardened men. And I can say that as a woman who can deadlift 300 pounds, can do more pull-ups than anyone else in this room, and run faster than any of you. You see, women are equal to men in many ways, but when we put women on the battlefield unnecessarily, it changes the dynamics of how a defense should operate, how a military should operate. And let me explain some of the reasons why this is an issue. You see, right now, we have 17 million 18 to 25-year-old men who are currently registered in the select services. That's 17 million already registered, all males. Right now, we have 1.3 million active duty military members serving. We have 800,000 reservists. There is no necessary reason to draft women with those numbers. Again, 17 million who are registered, 18 to 25-year-old men. Why would we draft young women who are 18 to 25 years old? There's no reason for it. We are a nation with a large population. We are not a small nation like Israel, who has to do that simply because they don't have the population to meet the need to form a military. Another thing that this panel, I hope, will take into consideration is we should learn how to spend our American taxpayers' dollars wisely. Drafting women will force the military to have to spend money in ways they didn't before. When you think about a Navy ship, there has to be places for women to sleep and men to sleep, and they have to be separate. There has to be restrooms and many facilities to keep separate for men and women. At least I would hope so, although things seem to be changing in that regard lately. But there's a cost concerned in that. There's also a cost concern in women's health care. Fortunately, women in the military receive great health care, but if we start drafting women and have just as many women in the military one day that we have as men, that's another cost we have to take into consideration. And then I'll tell you a quick story, and I thought this was really interesting. This is from actually April 5th, 2003. This is from a story from a ship in the Persian Gulf aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln. Now, here's what was quite interesting to me, is the captain said, since the Lincoln pulled out of its home port in Everett, Washington on July 20th, about 20 crew members have been sent home pregnant. 7 in the first few weeks. 7 in the first few weeks. They had to send 20 of them home just in the start. So there are issues when you're putting just as many women into the military as men, especially when there's no need to do it when we already have 17 million 18 to 25-year-old men currently registered in the select services. What is the point of drafting our daughters. And I can say that as a mother of 2 daughters that would be eligible for a military draft at their ages 23 and 21. I assure you, this mother does not want her daughters drafted into the military, but I would support them if they chose to join. So my amendment preserves the part of Section 513 and recognizes the solemnity of the military service, maintenance of the health of the selective service systems, and due process rights. I applaud the members who are leading this fight to protect women and the integrity of our armed forces, and I urge my colleagues to join me. The second amendment, Amendment 831, I offered with Representative Matt Gaetz, would add a section urging the resignation of Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and General Mark Milley. My amendment expresses that it's the sense of Congress that these men are unfit to service in their positions as Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs. General Milley's conduct lately shows exactly why this amendment is necessary, but unfortunate. General Mark Milley promised to warn his Chinese counterpart ahead of time in case of the Trump administration prepared a military strike against China. If that is true, General Mark Milley must be investigated, removed, and court-martialed. In 2 secret phone calls that took place October 30th, 2020, 4 days before the presidential election, and January 8th, 2 days after the Capitol riot, Milley allegedly assured his Chinese counterpart that the U.S. would not strike, and he would warn the Chinese in case of an attack. This man was not elected and was not President of the United States. He was not the Commander-in-Chief. A man who's so flustered by military tensions that he commits treason obviously does not have the temperance to lead an army. Milley clearly gave aid and comfort to America's principal adversary, the Chinese Communist Party. He must resign. I hope that my colleagues will recognize the need for Congress to demand his resignation. Thank you very much.
Before I go to Mr. Griffith, I would like to call up Mr. Graves from Louisiana to join the panel. I'm not going to go to, I'm just calling you up officially. So I'm going to go now to Mr. Griffith. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for allowing me the opportunity to discuss my amendment, which would remedy what I believe is an unconstitutional indefinite detention provision that is included in Section 1021B of the 2012 NDAA and is part of the current law. Current law allows for any American citizen on American soil to be detained indefinitely until the end of the 2001 AUMF. The DOD could conceivably indefinitely detain me or any member of this committee for doing something as simple as giving a neighbor a ride. Let me go into more detail. Suppose you have a neighbor that talked with you occasionally, but you didn't know particularly well, but you'd seen him around the community, but you didn't know him well. One day, as you're getting ready to leave for work, that neighbor shows up on your doorstep carrying their briefcase, one of those large kinds that lawyers like me love, you know, that carries everything, and says his car has broken down. Could you give him a ride to the courthouse or other federal facility? You say, sure, I'll give you a ride. You do not know that this individual is actually a member of a terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, etc., and that the briefcase he was carrying that you helped transport carried a bomb. By doing this act of kindness that most of us would probably agree to do for somebody that we'd seen around in the community, you could be indefinitely detained without due process under the language that's currently written in there. Now, fortunately, I don't want anybody to panic. DOD has not detained Americans in the United States in this fashion, and they have in the past communicated to my office that they don't think that they would do so, nor do they intend at any time to do so, nor do they think it's a part of their, it would not affect their ongoing operations. DOJ has said similarly. My amendment just fixes this constitutional language problem. And as a bonus, it doesn't affect what's happening now, what's happened in the past, and hopefully what would happen in the future. As I've stated, I wholeheartedly believe this provision violates the U.S. Constitution. But even if you think I'm wrong, and there are some who do, since it is currently not being used and not foreseen to affect ongoing operations, I ask this simple question. What's the harm in straightening out the language? Since nobody thinks that anybody would do it, and some think that they couldn't do it, why not straighten out the language so it doesn't have an appearance that we're violating the Constitution? This has prevented, this section, and my strong feelings about it, have prevented me from voting for any of the NDAAs since my first vote back in early 2011. I believe the current law restricts due process, and I believe this should be fixed now so that it will not potentially be used or abused in the future. Now, I'll tell you that I was at a gathering of freshmen earlier this year, and NDAA came up, and I said, well, you know, I'm an outlier. I haven't voted for it except one time in my tenure because, and I gave a brief description, at the end of the meeting, this freshman came up and said, my state legislature agrees with you. We passed a resolution saying we thought it was unconstitutional and should be taken out or changed. So apparently, I'm not that lone voice in the woods. There are a few others who feel this way. But my big question is and has always been, if it's on its face, it appears to be unconstitutional. If it could be by some future organization, majority, president, or whatever be abused, we have an obligation of the Constitution to correct the language and make it clear. So I ask that you find that it's proper for the floor to consider, and I hope that it will pass.
Thank you very much. I now yield to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Wenstrup.
Well, thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, members of this committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify today on my amendment, number 827. The amendment is fairly simple. It exempts certain members of the Reserves and National Guard from the separation history and physical exam requirement, also known as SHIPI. There's a reason for it. The SHIPI was designed for when people were leaving the military, active component. And it was designed to facilitate the transfer of care and support evaluation of disability claims. So in other words, it was like your final physical before leaving the military altogether. Under current law, the categories of service members this requirement applies to are members of the reserve component, which covers reserves and National Guard, who are separated from active duty if the active duty is for a period of 30 days or more. So you have reserve and guard that sometimes are called up for 30 days, 60 days, and then go back and are not leaving the military, they're just leaving that active component role. And so it doesn't prohibit anybody from getting any type of care or claiming a disability, a line of duty, mental health exam. All of that is still completely in place. But there's been a tremendous backlog for the medical teams and also for the time involved for our reserve and guard who may go out and do testing for COVID for 30 days, and then they are required to get this physical, and there's nothing's changed in their status except they went from orders, which put them in active component, back to their reserve or guard component. And so it's been a tremendous backlog on a military that already has a physician shortage, and so it's very challenging. So while this requirement makes complete sense in many of the categories laid out in what is labeled as 10 U.S.C. 1045, it's actually burdensome and unnecessarily costly in many ways. The reserve component members are simply moving from active duty back to their normal reserve or guard status. They're not leaving the military completely, which was really the intent of that examination. And due to the requirement that it applies to those on active duty for more than 30 days, members of the National Guard could end up being required to undergo an exam multiple times over the course of their careers or even multiple times in a single year. We've seen our Guard called up a lot in the last several years, and some of them very short term. So you could twice in a year be called up for 30 days, and each time you're going back to your unit. There's nothing wrong, but we as a military have the burden of having these exams performed. So as a physician and a service member, I believe any service member who needs or wants to undergo a physical exam for mental health assessment or whatever should absolutely have the opportunity to do so. And that's why nothing in this amendment prohibits a member of the reserve component or National Guard from requesting and receiving a physical exam, a mental health assessment if desired, filing a disability claim or line of duty, or receiving treatment for any of the above. And I think that by removing this requirement for a small subset of our service members, we can also free up some of these finite resources that we have to be directed towards those who are more in need of these physical exams and mental health assessments, especially those who want them for themselves. So one thing I'll add is it's not an official assessment, but my staff did reach out to CBO when we first began exploring this policy change, which I know many in the military would like to see happen. CBO noted that the very preliminary assessment making this change would reduce discretionary appropriations by about $25 million a year. And I think we could use $25 million towards a lot of health care for those who need it and need it more expeditiously if we did this today. That's all my amendment does. It removes the requirement, but not the option, for certain members of the reserve component to undergo a separation history and physical exam. And I urge you to take a look at it. You know, it says in the bill itself, you know, that unless the member is retiring or being discharged or dismissed from the armed services. So if you have a reservist or guards person who is leaving the military, then they get this exam, which was the intent, so that there's a transition to civilian care or VA care, whatever the case may be. So a lot of times it's just redundant because of how the law was written, and I hope that this can be ruled in order and give us a chance to make a positive change. It will save us money and doesn't do anything to diminish care. Actually, will give greater opportunities for those in need to get their care. And I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to raise one amendment that we filed for the NDAA bill. It has to do with the National Guard. I believe it's the last 4 NDAA bills that have come out of the House have included a provision that would allow for the National Guard, when deployed for federally declared disasters, for them to be paid either under the Disaster Relief Fund or under Title 32. This House mark does not include that provision. I'll say it again. I think it's the first time in 4 years. That it's not in there, so we offered an amendment that this provision historically has been bipartisan. Let me be very clear. In the past, we've linked it expressly to the Disaster Relief Fund, FEMA's disaster fund. In this case, as we did last year, all it does is simply open it up to authorization or eligibility under Title 32. If the National Guard is deployed under a federally declared disaster with the approval of the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Chairman, I urge y'all to include this amendment, make it eligible. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask your indulgence for just a minute if I can kind of freelance a little bit. I know you're also debating consideration of the CR. I'm not going to get into weeds on that. There's not text. I just want to bring up one thing, if you please indulge me. It's my understanding that they're going to potentially include some disaster spending in there. I represent South Louisiana. Of the 25 parishes in the disaster declaration area, we represent 13 of them. That's our whole district. Every parish in our district was declared. One, I commend the president for raising the issue of needing disaster response. I really appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, having gone through this many times and working with states all over the country, disasters, waiting to provide funds for Hurricane Ida, the most recent hurricane waiting as we've done in the past. For example, this bill is going to be the first allocation for recovery funds for Hurricanes Laura, Delta, Zeta, all the ones we experienced in 2020. I would strongly urge this committee, whoever's writing this bill, to either allow us to offer amendments that would include Ida funds or to actually include it in the base text. I think that this is absolutely critical. It is going to cost the federal government more money by waiting longer. And just to let you know, in the past when this has not been done, whether it's a Republican leadership or a Democrat leadership, I have fought for this. I think it is a mistake for us to drag on, to leave these people in conditions. Let me just describe, Mr. Chairman. Winds were measured up to 194 miles an hour. Storm surge was up to 15 feet. Rainfall up to 18 inches. We have areas that even today still don't have electricity, cell phone service, internet, don't have water and wastewater systems. I think that it's is absolutely critical for long-term recovery that we provide some funds. I don't think that the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program is the best mechanism. I think it's proven it can't respond with urgency, and I'd rather see funds provided to individuals through the Economic Development Administration, through the Department of Commerce, which has a much better track record of actually getting money to victims. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the
thank you.
opportunity to cover the additional topic. And
I would just suggest, we don't have the CR yet, so I would make some calls to the appropriations committees before they bring the bill to us to see whether they can make any accommodation.
And certainly we've been doing that.
Yeah,
sir.
and then we can figure it out from there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have any question. I just want to state for the record that the Pentagon opened all combat roles to women in 2015. A congressionally mandated commission recommended last year that women should be eligible for the draft. There are lawsuits alleging that excluding women, somehow unconstitutional. And 5 years ago, the Senate voted to make this change. John McCain supported it, and I trust his judgment immensely on these matters. We haven't had a draft since 1973, and I hope that we never have another one, quite frankly. But any parent I know would be just as terrified as sending their daughter into war as they are sending their son into war. And the way to prevent that is not to make who shoulders the burden dependent on gender. It's to make sure that we handle matters of war and peace seriously, and that war is the last resort. And some of us, in a bipartisan way, are trying to ensure that in the future, when we talk about going to war, that actually Congress does its job, that we don't, when we pass AUMFs, that they sunset, so that we have to regularly come back and debate them and decide whether or not what we did was right. And hopefully, maybe we can actually make those changes this year. So I will turn to Mr. Cole.
No questions.
Ms. Torres. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you acknowledging the administration of Richard Nixon, which ended the draft in this country. Very significant.
And my last name is McGovern.
Yeah, right. But I think Representative Green is correct to bring this amendment forward. I think this deserves a debate by the House, and I think it deserves every member of this House putting their card in and voting their conscience on this. And it would be a mistake to leave it buried in the substance of the bill. That we all like to vote for this bill. This may be a problem for some of us, and it is reasonable to come up to the Rules Committee, and I appreciate it being brought forward. This needs to be made in order as a standalone amendment. Every member should put their card in, yes or no. And then I further have a question for Mr. Griffith. We've had this discussion a few times over the last 10 or 12 years.
Yes, sir.
How in the world have you not gotten this fixed between Chairman McKeon and Chairman Thornberry and now Chairman Smith? I would think an effective lawyer such as yourself would have solved this problem by now.
I would have thought so too. But I will assure you that at times there are those who have felt that they just didn't want to open up the whole can of worms as to what was going on with, what was constitutional, what wasn't constitutional. There were times when it was thought that if we opened up this section, it might cause other amendments to come forward. I don't know what they would be. I'm just trying to straighten out this problem, which I've seen for years and tried to resolve. I feel it makes the entire act unconstitutional. And so I don't get to the other issues of debate because I stop right there. And we have an obligation too, and I think a lot of folks have relied on that. The courts aren't going to probably enforce this is what they think. And in the one case where they got close to an issue like this, they did decide against some language, but it's not directly on point. And further, we as Congress have an obligation to uphold the Constitution. The courts are not the only ones that have to do that. We have an obligation to hold it up to, and I don't really like feeling like I've got to have somebody spend, if in the future it's used improperly and abused, in my opinion, I wouldn't want to see somebody have to pony up tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to take this matter up to the Supreme Court of the United States, I think ultimately it would be found unconstitutional. But in the meantime, somebody languishes in indefinite detention. Goodlatte at one time tried to add in, I'm just trying to add in a scienter or knowledge requirement. Goodlatte tried to put in, and the House approved it, a habeas corpus provision. The Senate took that one out, which would have greatly improved it. But I think we have to do something to make it clear beyond any doubt that this is not to be used lightly and should not be used against American citizens on American soil unless the military can show some evidence, I'm not requiring proof beyond a reasonable doubt, just some evidence that there was that scienter, that knowledge that they were in fact assisting a terrorist in the furtherance of a terrorist act.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I've just observed that I serve on another committee with the gentleman from Virginia, and when he raises a question like this, it's not something that's done for any reason other than the serious desire to make sure that we do our job as representatives of the people and not enact laws that are unconstitutional, and then expect the courts to save us from ourselves. I've heard him make this argument on multiple occasions in the Energy and Commerce Committee. If the ability exists to remedy the problem, I think you're right. Why not fix it rather than let it remain a problem? And clearly it has remained a problem in your mind for over 10 years' time.
Well, and the real fear is that while it's not been used, someday we could have some rogue actor who chose to use it, and 10 years later, perhaps you get your justice in the courts, but you've lost 10 years of your life when all you did was perhaps, and there are thousands of examples I could give, but that's the one I think makes it clearest. All you did was give somebody a ride. You had no idea they were a terrorist carrying a bomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we should take his amendment into consideration. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter.
Just a couple questions for Dr. Winstrup. So why you would think that this amendment that you're asking for would already be the law, that, you know, until you're separating from the military, you wouldn't have your final exam. So is it just that the law is written too broadly, or what's occurred?
So it's written so that as you leave your active military service, you have this, you know, you get your final exam. Plus, we learn a lot, you know, what's happened to you health-wise over your military career. And then it's there to, you know, establish any disability that you may be leaving with, et cetera. I mean, anybody in reserve or guard can do that as well. But because it was written that as you leave active component, you get this exam. Well, reserve and guard are not active component until they've been federalized and gone to work. And like I said, they're called up to active duty. And sometimes it's only 30-some days. And then you have everyone in that unit, it could be company size or who knows what, and everyone then has to go through this physical. When they're not leaving military service, they're just leaving active component. And so it doesn't deny any of the other entities of healthcare and claims and disability and line of duty injury or any of those things. It just says, you don't have to do this. And it's a tremendous burden to take all of these people perfectly healthy and just went and served 30 days somewhere, and now they all are lined up having to go through this physical exam.
Did you offer this in committee?
No, it's just more come to my awareness recently, and so that's why I'm offering it here. I wish I had offered it sooner, but I've become more aware of the details of it, especially as a reservist myself. And so you have, you know, the medical component of our military going, we can't keep up with all this, and so sometimes they don't even get that exam for months and months. And it's hard for a guard or reserve to go back home to your regular job and then still have to fulfill this obligation at some point when there's really not the personnel, and the personnel would rather be taking care of the people that say, I need some mental help, or I have a line of duty injury. And then it's all there. So none of that is taken away. It just, and even if you're leaving and you say, you know, I'd like to get a physical before you can get in line, but it gives you the option of not having to do it when and only when you are returning to your reserve or guard unit.
Okay, thank you. Sounds like a reasonable amendment to me. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Fishbach. All right, who's left here? All right, Mr. Raskin, Ms. Scanlon, Mr. Morelli.
I'm good, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. DeSagne, Ms. Ross, Mr. DeGoose. No other questions? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Our next panel is Mr. Moore from Utah and Mr. Mast from Florida. I think that's it, right? I don't see anybody else here. Thank you.
No, he's right. I agree with you too.
Yep, there you go. Why don't you, Mr. Mast, why don't you begin?
All good?
All good. You're all, just make sure your microphone's on. Then that means it's on.
Thank you for the opportunity to address you all today. I appreciate it. Oh, I guess it was a different shade of green. There we go. It was green. It wasn't the right shade of green. My amendment specifically today, it relates to this, specifically Lake Okeechobee, where there are U.S. Army Corps of Engineer personnel, uniformed personnel stationed, so uniformed soldiers that on a yearly basis are being poisoned by what's in this jar. This jar is well beyond the threshold of what the EPA did a study, determined was poisonous, 8 parts per billion microcystin algae. This measured early this summer, before things got really bad, about 865 parts per billion. Study also spoke specifically of the fact that this would remain as an airborne toxin for a distance of up to 10 miles. If you're curious about the half-life on something like this, obviously it's it's going to linger in the air much longer at a level of 865 parts per billion than at a level of 8 parts per billion. To talk about how greatly people are affected by this, there's not a great number of U.S. Army personnel that are affected by this, but those that are affected greatly. They're surrounded by this for literally hundreds of yards around the lock and dam structures that they work at on Lake Okeechobee, 5 separate locations around Lake Okeechobee where they will become surrounded by this all summer long. The amendment would specifically ask a couple of things, recognizing that it becomes, the EPA says it's toxic at a level of 8 parts per billion, that being the threshold mark for saying that uniformed personnel would receive a hazardous duty pay for their work 8-10 hours a day, sitting on top of this, breathing it in, which is unbearable. I could tell you, I could open it up for you if you want to know how unbearable it is. Stays on your clothes, comes out of your skin as you're taking a shower in the hours thereafter. And then in addition to receiving a hazardous duty for those personnel stationed around it, having something go in their file that denotes their exposure to this toxin that, as noted medically, will lead to Alzheimer's, kidney failure, liver failure, as well as a number of other hazards that the list could go on and on and on. I spent my career as a bomb technician in ordnance, and I would say this as something literal. If this was something that was in a 155 millimeter round projectile that was fired out towards an enemy or fired back at us, guys like me would have to go out there in mop suits, determine a vector for where the wind was blowing and what direction something like this was going to go, how the communities around that would be affected, and we're letting our service members get poisoned by this for 8-10 hours a day every single year. There was an issue that came up where T&I asked to have jurisdiction over military personnel, hazardous duty pays, and I don't want some kind of backroom deal going on here where this is going to, as much as I love transportation and infrastructure, I sit on that committee. I haven't been given the opportunity to handle military personnel issues there on T&I. If that's going to be the case, then I would assume that we're going to get to start handling military personnel issues also for Coast Guard and other agencies. So I think there's another question that's at play here. I'm not the only one that thinks that. The parliamentarian, I'll submit this for the record to you guys, also noting from the parliamentarian that they say that this is germane to the NDAA as it is a military personnel and pay issue. I thank you all for the
No, and
time.
I thank
Happy
you.
to answer any
I think-
questions.
I think we're waiting to hear from CBO to see if there's a budget. That's the one thing we're waiting for right now. But, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. Appreciate your testimony as well. Distinguished members of the committee, I stand before you to urge your support for Amendment 293 to H.R. 4350. Like many of us, I was heartbroken from the stories coming from Afghanistan as our office scrambled to help evacuate as many U.S. citizens and eligible Afghan families as possible. I've offered this amendment to ensure that the Taliban answers for every human rights crime committed against American citizens and our Afghan partners. My amendment simply requires the Secretary of State and Director of National Intelligence to report on incidences of human rights violations by the Taliban against U.S. citizens, their family members, and Afghan citizens who have supported American military and diplomatic efforts. We know that human rights violations have proliferated in the wake of the Taliban takeover. On July 23, 2021, as Taliban control expanded, Foreign Policy reported incidences of forced marriages and sex slavery. When the Taliban took over the town of Saigon, with an H, in mid-July, they ordered local mosques to make lists of all young women and widows due to the Taliban adherence to an ideology that regards women as commodities or spoils of war. On August 12, 2021, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul said it had received deeply disturbing reports that could constitute war crimes of the Taliban executing members of the Afghan military who had surrendered. We all know of these stories. We've seen them. It's clear that a comprehensive report on the misconduct of the Taliban is necessary to ensure Taliban officials face full accountability for their crimes. After nearly 20 years of continuous deployment, the sacrifice of over 20,000 American lives, and $2 trillion in taxpayer money, the American people deserve an accounting of Taliban human rights violations during and after the U.S. withdrawal. In summary, I sit on the Armed Services Committee as well. We submitted, right, as things were, as we were all watching and as this all unfolded, the Afghanistan Accountability Act. And candidly, I submitted that act with a sincere intent, not a partisan intent, to be able to instill accountability into this whole situation. We were fortunate to get a portion of that into the NDAA already. I never expected that act. I've been in Congress 9 months, enough to know that maybe a freshman from the minority is not going to pass his law the second that he puts it in the docket. But our hope was that that Intel and that Foreign Relations and Armed Services could have a portion of this act, that it could go into help these as we continue to have committee hearings going forward. That is my intent. Again, I will emphasize, this is not a partisan intent. The language is very simple in that it just requires reporting of these activities. There are commissions that have been established. There was good work in the Armed Services Committee markup. I was really proud of it. And this is just one extra piece that would require a reporting mechanism be in place for the NDAA. So with that, I'll just conclude my comments. Appreciate the chance to come and speak to rules, and thanks for the opportunity.
It was great to have you here. Thank you. Mr. Cole.
A couple quick things. First, I'd ask the committee stipulate that Mr. Mass not be asked to open his jar, that we accept what he has to say.
Moving away.
Absolute fact. But seriously, I appreciate what you're doing here. We've all dealt with these situations from Agent Orange to burn pits where people didn't think about this. I particularly like the fact that you noted in the record so that if somebody runs into a problem like this down the road, we've established an official record that it could be brought out to help that individual. I think it's really important, so I thank you for bringing it forward. I certainly hope it's included. And I'll say the same thing about Mr. Moore. Just quickly, just so the whole committee knows, what was your background before you were in Congress?
I have official time on my resume with the U.S. State Department, so I have a diplomatic and intelligence background.
Okay, I just wanted people to be aware of that. Very serious player when it comes to these kinds of issues and knows what you're talking about. And so, again, I appreciate you singling out the work of the committee because I, like you, think it did a really good job in very many areas, but I'd love to see this added as well if we can get it on there. And with that, Mr. Chairman, yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres. Dr. Burgess.
No further questions, but I do want to thank both our witnesses. These are both important amendments that you've brought us and I urge the committee to make them in order.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Just want to thank the gentleman, and please don't leave your exhibit.
You know
I was going to, but that's
Mr. Raskin, Ms. Scanlon, Mr. Morelli, Mr. Desaulniers, Ms. Ross, Mr. Neguse, people are all on virtual here. No other questions? Thank you both very, very much. Appreciate it. Leave the, yeah, okay. All right. So, nobody wants to testify? So without objection, the committee stands in recess subject to call of the chair. And, yeah, so my hope. What did I say? Did I say?
Yeah, if you want to go off the record, but could you?
Without objection, the committee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair. Okay. All right.